But, from your perspective, what have you been able to figure out so far?
Right. So the idea is that standardly, my colleagues in the sciences have assumed that space-time is the fundamental nature of reality, space-time and its contents. So space-time and energy fields and particles, and then groups of particles that we call atoms and molecules and organisms and objects. And now many physicists are saying that space-time is doomed and that there's a deeper reality beyond space-time that gives rise to space-time as a mathematical projection. So the idea is going to be that what we call space-time and matter is a mathematical projection of some deeper reality outside of space-time. Now, of course,
the question is, because we've already talked about that. My question is, how does it happen?
Right. So I was just trying to give the background of what my physicist friends are doing, but and so they don't endorse what I'm about to say, which is my ideas about consciousness, right? I just wanted to put it in the context.
Yeah.
So what I'm proposing is that consciousness is the fundamental nature of objective reality, and space-time and physical objects are data structures or perceptions within consciousness. And so for that, we have to have a mathematically precise theory of consciousness and how it operates. And then we still have to do the same kind of mathematical operation that I was describing that the physicists are doing, which is to show how the dynamics of consciousness, which is outside of space and time entirely, right? It's much, much more complicated and many, many more levels than space-time. It's far, far richer. How that dynamics gets projected into space-time, and there I'm looking for a completely precise mathematical model, and that's literally what I'm working on even this morning before we get on. So, and interact with that consciousness, and so the idea then is that matter is not a fundamental entity. This is now from my point of view, not what the physicists say.
Right.
That it's something that it's a data structure that we create on the fly. So just like the key thing, most of us think about like physical objects like the moon, as of course they're there when no one looks. They always exist. They have their own existence on their own, independent of perception. And so in this new approach in which consciousness is fundamental, the moon is an experience that I have in consciousness when I choose to act in certain ways, and I render that experience. But when I choose to act in other ways, now I'm rendering something else. Now I'm rendering the sun, or I'm rendering a mountain. But these things don't exist independent of me.
Right. And this to me is quite interesting, because in spiritual tradition, this in many ways has been the premise of how we see the world, relating to it as a projection of one's own consciousness, and also saying that nothing can exist outside the experience of it, and that the outer world therefore does not exist. But what is difficult for most people to grasp is that if I place an apple on the table and other people also see the same apple, and they say, like, that apple exists, but according to a kind of spiritual way of thinking, it actually does not, because it's a collective experience being created. And this brings me back to resistance and understanding. This is also why I asked you how this happens, because the model of resistance basically explains how consciousness is being turned into manifested reality and how it can be experienced. But the principle of resistance states that it's not possible for anything to exist outside the experience, because the one experiencing or observing it is the author of the object, which means that when, for instance, you look at the moon and it's there, and you look away and everyone will say it's still there, it's because it's then also part of collective experience. It's not only collective experience of humans, but it's also collective. It's part of the collective experience in the universe. So there are many levels of collective consciousness in action at the same time, both horizontally and vertically, which means that as long as somebody is experiencing that object as a mirror of the projection of that observer's consciousness, it has to exist. And as I also said last time, without it, it cannot exist. So basically, existence is, both individual and collective renderings. So when you leave a space, it means that on many different levels, this might be a key ingredient in a collective experience or collective narrative, a building block, which means that it will still exist as part of that collective projection. But when you are not observing it, that manifestation will slightly change, because when you are not part of the experience of it, that the kind of like source code to that manifestation will change, because it's the result of everyone observing it at the same time. So this is also why understanding dimensionality, resistance, vertical and horizontal consciousness are keys to how this whole thing operates. But I think, for many people, it's a stretch to accept that the outer world does not really exist beyond the individual and collective projections. So how do you kind of sell that also to the scientific community?
Right. I think that there's an analogy that's accessible to most people that really, in some sense, turns this around and turns it from something that you go, that's impossible. It can't be that way. It can't be that I create objects, because if I don't look at the apple and turn my head away, you can still see the apple, right? And so clearly the apple must exist. Or if I take the apple and I don't look at it and I drop it, I know that if I turn my head back, I know where the apple's going to be. And so I can predict that. And so there's an analogy, I think, that will make that just obvious that it's possible that we're creating what we see. And it's, again, in virtual reality. So suppose that you decide to play a game of virtual tennis with somebody. So you put on your headset and bodysuit, and you find yourself immersed on a tennis court with a net, and you see the avatar of your friend across the net, and you pick up a yellow tennis ball, and you hit it with your racket, and your friend hits it back to you, and you start playing with the tennis ball. So you both talk about the tennis ball, and you're both hitting the tennis ball. But strictly speaking, you know that the tennis ball that you see is just something that you create because of your headset and the rendering that you do in your own headset, and that your friend on the other side of the court doesn't even have the same headset on that you have. And if you turn your headset away, you don't see the tennis ball. So you might say, look, I can prove that this tennis ball really exists, this VR tennis ball. I'm not going to look at the tennis ball, and I'm going to ask my friend, does she still see it? And they can say, yeah, I still see it. And you can say, well, that proves that there really is a real tennis ball. Well, no, I don't see it because I'm not rendering it. My friend sees it because she's just turning her headset in such a way that she's getting the right pixels to her headset, and she then in her consciousness is creating a tennis ball. And you can, in anything that you could do, all the standard examples that we give that prove that the moon is there or the tennis ball is there when no one's looking, just think about doing that in virtual reality with a friend with the headset and bodysuit on. You'll get the same answer that you would get, and you realize that the VR context makes it clear that at least it's possible that we're creating this stuff on the fly and deleting it just as we turn our headsets around. And that's what I'm claiming. The VR case is actually true about everyday life. Space-time, as I perceive it now, and all the objects are the VR that I'm creating right now. And if I don't happen to look at the apple, then I'm not creating it. But if you say I still see the apple, well, that's because you're creating it in your headset. And people will often go, well, look, that doesn't hold water because you can reach over and touch it. So yeah, I don't see the apple, but if you close your eyes and reach over and touch it, you'll feel it. So that proves the apple was there all along. And again, no, that the experience of touch is also your creation. You create everything that you touch. And so you could have, again, a bodysuit, a VR bodysuit, where you have haptic feedback. So that your haptic feedback is giving you the feeling of the racket in your hand and the hitting of the ball and also picking up the tennis ball. And so the feedback itself from touch is, again, a virtual reality that you create when you interact, and you don't create it when you're not interacting. And so that's one analogy that I think will, if people think about, let me put it this way. I think for our generation, this might be hard to grasp, the idea that we create what we see. But I think 15, 20 years from now, the generation that's raised where they spend a good part of their day in VR worlds, this is going to be just like trivial. They're going to go, how could...
Observing the same object, and yet it will be two different spaces and two different objects, and that distance will be greater and greater based on the difference in level of consciousness. And I think this is also something that people gradually will accept. And I think this way of thinking will completely transform human sciences.
Right. I certainly agree, and I think that there's a way for people to see that idea and for it to make sense to them, and that is that in very prosaic ways, everyday kinds of things. I mean, so I'm watching a tennis match on television, and I watch, and I'm no tennis pro or anything like that, but I'm having a good time watching the game, and then the announcer points out something. They're looking at the same thing I'm looking at, but they point out something about the serve or the footwork of the person. And I realized, whoa, this person is looking at the same game, but what they're seeing is utterly different from me because they know how to see and I don't. Or listening to music. If I'm listening to some classical music, again, being inexpert, I have my level of understanding and enjoyment. But when I talk with a real musician and they start pointing out the subtleties and so forth, I realize, oh, this person, we're being exposed to the same thing, but they're living in a far richer world of experience. Or even someone who's an expert at wines, right? I take a sip of wine and it tastes great to me. And then someone else who's like a connoisseur, they taste it and they start talking about, oh, well, this came from such and such a region and has these subtleties, and I realize once again that we're tasting the same chemicals, but the world of our experience is utterly different, and we see that anytime that there's as we get an expertise. So a mathematician, I look at an equation, looks like a mess to me, and a mathematician who has studied that will look at it and go, oh wow, that's beautiful. This is all the connections that it has. So we have this. So we know that in some sense, as we become more engaged in a particular area, as we study, as we play more tennis or whatever it might be, study wines or music or so forth, we're building deeper and deeper perceptual systems, and we're actually going into a richer and richer world of consciousness in that area. And so we see this in the sort of small things of everyday life. I think that you're pointing out that this goes on in even bigger and deeper ways.
Yes, because that will be my point, because everything you're describing is what we refer to as horizontal expansion. Right. It's basically, you're relating to the same space, the same manifestation, but you have a richer, and more kind of textured experience, but still of the same object. Now, it's once you go into the vertical expansion, the very space and therefore the premise and the math of time space changes. It's basically saying that when you listen to classical music, when you go into the vertical, there will be more instruments. The symphony will be longer. It's a different piece. Where the piece that you listen to included, but it's just a small part of it. So you get a bigger contextual experience where there is more, and maybe even what you are listening to in that horizontal level is not even the main part of it. So it changes on a more in a more fundamental way. And this is why, understanding the difference between the vertical and the horizontal is so kind of fundamental to kind of explore consciousness.
Like your description of spirituality really is about exploring what is. And science over the last 400 years has developed these incredible tools that humanity has never had before. The tools of mathematical precision, careful experiments, and then the cycle of experiments, testing theories, and then taking the theories to new levels. So that one reason I'm, engaged in these conversations and delighted by these conversations is because I think that the ideas that the spiritual traditions have had for thousands of years are now, for the first time, some scientists are opening up to the possibility of exploring those ideas with these rigorous tools that they've developed. The barrier has been that we as scientists have taken space-time to be fundamental. Anything outside of space-time we could call, supernatural or spiritual or whatever, and sort of dismiss it that way. I'm not saying that all scientists, of course, dismiss these things, but I'm saying that there was this physicalist bent toward science that tended to dismiss anything that isn't inside space and time and isn't a product of matter and energy operation within space-time. But now that scientists, using their own tools, have realized that space-time can't be fundamental, and their own methodology is telling them that they need to find they need to go vertical now. Space-time